I know he had this big crush on Ava Gardner.
Oh,
so to
who
get
wouldn't?
to, right?
Do you
Literally. I've done like 3 events at the Ava Gardner Museum, and in one of the first time I was there, it was maybe 10 years ago, and so I'm standing next to a life-size cutout of Ava Gardner, and I'm holding Allie, right? And I have this big smile on my face, and Allie isn't even looking at me; she's looking at Ava Gardner. and I look at this picture, and I'm like, what was I even thinking? Standing next to a cutout of Ava Gardner, like no mortal looks good next to Ava Gardner.
Right. Who wouldn't be drawn?
But having done, like I did an event, I think it was 2 years ago for Ava Gardner's 100th, and you know, she apparently was the nicest person on the planet too. She was just warm and accessible. She often went back to her hometown. They told this story that weekend. Very authentic. You know, just a real person. Of like, she was in the bath in her hometown in this it's a small town in North Carolina, and you know, a bunch of the like high school girls or kids found out, you know, she was there, and she could hear them downstairs talking, and she just had them come on up. I mean, they were girls, and you know, sit while she was taking a bubble bath and chat with them. I mean, she just was
talk about down to earth.
Right, exactly. So, and I know he felt really lucky to be paired with Jean Tierney. You know, she was extremely talented, but also, you know, what was kind of great about her was she was sort of this tragic heroine. She had all these tragedies in her life. And so that added this kind of layer, you know, and she was an unusual beauty. You know, she wasn't just like cookie cutter beauty. So I think of the two from the 40s, you know, those were the honor of being with Jean Tierney, you know, and I think, you know, he wouldn't have said this, but Jean Tierney was always getting herself mixed up with the wrong guy, you know, and including John F. Kennedy Jr.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, senior president, future President Kennedy. You know, so my dad was sort of that, you know, he was a safe person, you know, he was a gentle man.
Right. That's every account I've ever heard. And then were there his co-stars on the male side? Were there? I mean, you came a little later in life because your father was almost 51, and then your mom was 45. And so, you know, but you must have seen really cool dinner parties.
Sure.
You know,
I mean, my brother, you know, my mother was always telling me as a kid, your brother was the best conversationalist at the dinner parties. I was like, well, you don't even have dinner parties anymore, so. But I always felt like, you know, he got to see the really
right, because he's 22
years older than
I.
So he got to go to.
You were the surprise baby.
A total surprise. But yeah, you know, so our closest group of friends were Eddie Albert from, you know, Green Acres, and he had a long Broadway and career, and his wife Margot, who was like one of my favorite people on the planet. If you've ever seen Lost Horizons, the movie with Errol Flynn, she's the one name actress, Margot, but she's was an extraordinary woman. I mean, just amazing, like as bright a light as my dad. Like you know, my dad would walk into a room, it was like megawatts, and Margot was like that too. And they were like, Eddie would have to be my surrogate dad if my dad was away at like father-daughter dances or picnics or whatever. So they were really close. Let's see who else was close. I just did a thing last Saturday at the Hammer Museum in LA, and it was the UCLA television archives. So they showed like 2 hours of TV clips of my dad's, and I hadn't seen some of them, but one of them they showed was This Is Your Life, and it was kind of a reminder who all their friends were. So they were often very creative couples. Like Dorothy McGuire was a well-known actress, and she was one of the founders with Gregory Peck of the La Jolla Playhouse, and Dorothy and her husband John Swope was a really amazing photographer, so they were great friends. Patrons of the arts, Sydney and Francie Brody, who were huge patrons of the arts, and if you go to the LA County Art Museum, like a huge one whole wing is the Sydney and Francis Brody wing. Fanny Bryce was a really good friend, and her son Billy was my dad's best male friend.
I see.
So Billy was a well-known abstract expressionist artist, William Bryce, and really well-known in California, and Billy was my dad's best friend. So Billy and Shirley, you know, so those were sort of their core people who, you know, they did everything with, traveled with. Another really close friend was a man named Henry Dreyfuss. And Henry Dreyfuss was one of 4 people who invented the field of industrial design. He literally designed the John Deere tractor, the 20th Century Limited train, the Princess phone, the thermostat.
Wow.
Amazing, amazing. And his wife was like, they were like Charles and Ray Eames. His wife Doris was his partner in everything. And so we spent every Thanksgiving with them. And
fun.
so, you know, they had really interesting friends, and they weren't sort of pretentious people. They were people with lots of interests, and it was an amazing way to grow up. Like Henry, so I was his grandkid's age, so I always had someone to play with, you know, at Thanksgiving, which was really nice for me. And so every year Henry would teach us something, but he would make something. So one year he took paper, you know, shopping bags, like you can still get at the grocery store, paper ones. And he wanted to teach us about Africa, so that was Africa themed. So he made these masks, I mean, that were unbelievable, out of brown, you know, and I was a giraffe, which was perfect for me, you know, since the tall kid, you know. But he taught, you know, every year he would teach us about something. He was just this amazingly talented person. He was the first adult who said I could call him Henry, you know, not Uncle so-and-so or Aunt so-and-so. The one, and my godparents were really interesting people. Do you remember getting the TV guide back in the day?
Oh, yeah.
So the back page of the TV guide was always an essay, and it was by Cleveland Amory. And Cleveland Amory was a really interesting guy because he was a Boston Brahmin family, and he wrote a book called The 400 about sort of the, you know, wealthiest families in America. And he was a commentator on the Today Show. Well, one day they did a segment on the Today Show about vivisection to animals, and he was so appalled by this that he spoke out against it on the on the Today Show. He just came out of his mouth. He was just like, this is a horrible thing, and they fired him on the spot. Like, talk about cancel culture. They literally, because he must have risked like a advertiser or something.
Yeah.
And so they fired him on the spot, where he ended up creating something called the Fund for Animals, which is now part of the Humane Society. And Cleveland, to grow up with Cleveland was this amazing thing. His wife was a woman named Martha Amory, and she was his, again, equal partner in this. So with the Fund for Animals, he did things like, the best one was, he was watching TV one night, there was a news show about how the burros had overpopulated in the Grand Canyon. And they were the solution of the, you know, government was to just kill them all. And he's like, not on my watch. So he called everyone he knew. He spent 3 years, he raised all the money, and he single-handedly airlifted every damn burro out of the Grand Canyon. Wow. So and it took multiple, you know, like rounds of this, but in the first round, as they're getting airlifted out, this little burro, female, sort of attached itself to him. And he named her Friendly, because she was just so friendly. And he had homes, but as he's standing surrounded by all these birds, like, what am I gonna do with these? So then he bought up all this land in East Texas, and he and Doris Day did the hooved animals, and it's called Black Beauty Sanctuary. It's still the Humane Society's animal sanctuary, still to this day. So like, if you see a story like, in the last 3 years, there was a tiger that got loose from someone's home, and it was roaming the streets of Houston. Where does a tiger end up? At Black Beauty, you know. So I grew up with these people who kind of put their money where their mouth was, you know, and those were the people my parents were really drawn to.
Wow.
You know, because my dad, it was the same thing. He believed that the art should be accessible to everyone, and he dedicated his life to making art accessible to everyone.
What a fascinating childhood. And to have those influences around you all the time. And I would imagine that he and your mom, because they were both in the industry and they have all these creative drives, if you will. I gotta ask this only because I'm teaching a Hitchcock class right now. Now I know that he did a...
They showed that at the Hammer.
Oh yeah. So he did one episode, one stint, and Alfred Hitchcock, he didn't direct all of those, but he did this one with Vincent Price and with James Gregory. Now, when I think about Hitchcock and your father, I see a lot of similarities. They both love the arts. They
Yeah.
loved paintings. They loved,
Right.
you know, that level of art, and they were both gourmets with their food. Did they, and of course, you know, horror fans would see
Sure.
the other resemblance there. Were they friends outside at all?
You know,
Did they
there
seem
were
to have-
acquaintances because there was crossovers. For example, Joseph Cotton, who, you know, obviously
Right.
did Hitchcock. My dad and Joe were in the Mercury Theater together, and they were great friends. And then,
Okay.
of course, they did Dr. Fives together. Dr.
Yes,
Fives together.
yes.
And so, you know, there were crossovers. You know, there's sort of the core group, and then there's the bigger group, and the
Sure.
bigger group, and then the kind of people you're like, oh, I have nothing. I wouldn't have anything in common with John Wayne or whatever, right?
What would
you
we
know?
talk about?
Right. But you know, so yes, there was that sort of larger group, and certainly my mother was British, the whole British
Right,
thing.
that connection too.
Yeah, but you know, I always, when I was younger, before I kind of researched everything, I was kind of mad that my dad didn't get to do like a Hitchcock movie.
Right,
You know, it
right.
would have been he would have been so
How fun
great.
would that be?
But you know, maybe in some ways, you know, if you think about it, like the villains aren't really the focus of a Hitchcock movie. You know,
It's the chase.
Yeah, exactly.
Less about the
Yeah.
actual ending there.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and to kind of transition to horror, because we have a lot of horror fans, but before we get to that, I do want you to talk just a little bit about your mom, because your mom was Mary.
Yeah.
She was in the industry as well in her own right.
Yeah, she was a really interesting person. So my dad's first wife, he met in the Mercury Theater, and he thought she was younger than she was because she lied about her age. But hers is a really interesting story. Her grandfather was a man named Lawrence Barrett, and he was the acting partner of Edwin Booth. And Edwin Booth was the brother of John Wilkes Booth. But Edwin Booth was by far the more famous of the two. And Edwin Booth was this, you know, huge force in the 1800s in the acting world. And he and Lawrence Barrett started the Players Club, which is the club for actors. And so my dad's first wife grew up in Massachusetts, and she was being abused as a child. And so she, at age 14, got out of Massachusetts, somehow got to New York City, knocked on the door of the Players Club and said, I demand you put me up, you know, and they're like, there's no women allowed. And she said, well, my grandfather started this place. So she became this big melodrama star when melodrama was a thing, but then melodrama kind of faded. And so she was reinventing herself, doing the Mercury Theater, and so she married my dad. They both went out to Hollywood, but then my dad's star went up, and my brother's mothers went down. So that was the first wife, and they had a very contentious divorce chronicled by all the gossip columns. It was ugly. She had substance abuse issues, and so finally, you know, it was just bad. So my mother, who was like English, had her feet on the ground. You know, she was super creative, but, you know, was not going to have substance abuse problems. I mean, everybody drank too much and did everything to
During that
excess
time,
in those
yeah.
days, but, you know, she wasn't like going to a doctor with my brother and getting, you know, B12
Right,
shots,
right.
you know, which was what was going on. My poor brother, who's 85 and doing just great, but
Yeah.
you know, he had the childhood
Like
I
David O.
didn't have.
Selznick with the...
Right, like he had the tough childhood, I did not. So, long story short, they were doing my mother's other best friend, not the Cleveland Ambry's wife, was a dancer in New York, and her in-laws were huge art collectors. They were from Ohio, but they lived in Bel Air. And so my Aunt Ruth called them and said, you know, my dear friend Mary's coming. She's designing her first movie in Hollywood. She'd done a ton of stuff on Broadway. She worked for Billy Rose. She designed the men's costumes in Oklahoma. She did Cole Porter musicals. I mean, she was really successful. They brought her out to Hollywood, and so Ruth said, you know, please kind of look out for her. So they invited her to a dinner party in Bel Air, and they knew my dad from the art world, and they sat the two of them next to each other, and that's how they met. Because in those days, my mom said, like, you know, the staff, which I think of as the crew, but my mother always called them the staff, and the talent didn't meet, you know. But my mother was, you know, she'd grown up all over the world. She was born in England, grew up in Shanghai, and in Canada. She was a dancer, like her best friend was Merce Cunningham, and then she became a designer. So she was this super creative person, and they became like a team. And I think that's why many of their couple friends were creative partners. They were a husband and wife who were creative partners, or, you know, there were also, like, you know, gay men in that group too, and they were creative partners. Like, they were always couples that were creative, you know, and I think that's what they were drawn to. And so it just took off. They lived in this home that became required viewing for the UCLA art students because it had so much amazing art. My dad would give talks on art. He was on the different art boards and stuff. My dad would give talks on art, and he went and gave one out in East Los Angeles, and my mother was sitting there looking at the audience at this graduation speech, and she said to my dad afterwards, you know, everybody's saying LA County Museum and, you know, UCLA, they'd like some of our art collection, but we should start something here in East LA because this is America. Because even now, it's like all first generation college students, they're, you know, Mexican American, Latin American, they're indigenous, they're Asian, and she's like, this is America, this is, you know, and there's plenty of art on the west side, let's give it here. And now, if you ever have a chance to go to East LA, it's an amazing, amazing collection, and it's there for the community, the students, but now there's crossover between the East and the West, so they're getting to do amazing art shows, so it's very
And
cool.
you serve on the board for the Vincent Price
yeah.
Museum for a long time.
Yeah, a long time, yeah. So my mother was, you know, super, super creative, but, you know, she also was somebody who wasn't comfortable in front of the camera, you know, and my dad was such a, you know, he was always out there doing things, and my mother would have, you know, like, if somebody came over to our house and my dad answered the door, he'd be like, come on in. If somebody came over and my mother answered the door, she'd be like, could you
Schedule
leave
next week.
Yes, and right, call and make an appointment. You know, my mother didn't want like drop-in visits.
And they did at least one film together, right? Where she was the designer?
They did, yeah, it was up in Central Park,
Right,
the one where
right,
they
the
met.
one
Yeah.
where they met.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, she worked on a ton. She was the in-house designer for all of Burt Lancaster's films, all the Hechtel and Lancaster, which is that'd be an interesting class, all those films. She did all of
sure.
those, yeah, so,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Well, we are at the Slash and Bash Film
Yeah, so
Festival.
we have to do horror.
So we definitely want to speak about
Yes,
horror,
good
of
point.
course. And but horror was only about a third of the films that he did.
Yep.
But we are don't worry, we're definitely going to talk about it. I would love to hear. Well, first of all, it should be pointed out you were kind of squeamish about
I
scary
still
films.
don't understand why you like scary things. I mean, what I should tell you is that, you know, I knew my dad was an actor, but it's a concept, right? Like, you know, when I was little, so they thought, well, we're going to show her what an actor is. So he was doing a play in Los Angeles called Peter Pan. Pretty safe play. Kids go to Peter Pan all the time. That's who half the audience is. And my dad was playing Captain Hook, right? So they take me, you know, to see my dad in Captain Hook. Now, my mother, I mentioned, was English. Like, no public displays of affection. Stiff upper everything, right? And she's a professional in the theater. And she's with this child who is loudly saying things like, why does Daddy have a hook? Why is he being so mean to those boys?
And
I'm
how
like,
old were you at this point?
4.
Oh,
And I'm
yeah.
so upset because my dad was like she had to take me backstage during intermission, which you never do. You don't go backstage during intermission because I was freaking out.
Sure.
But I will tell you that she clearly wasn't that worried about my future mental health, because I have a series of 8 photographs in black and white. She's taking the pictures, right, of me. So the first one, I'm like, you know, completely freaked out, and my dad's trying to show me that the hook isn't real, and then he's feeding me popcorn, and then he has me up on his knee, and finally I'm smiling.
Oh, that's fun.
But anyway, I think they thought we're never doing that again. We are never doing that again. So the only thing I was ever allowed to watch was the TV. And you could tell he did horror movies, but he's like spoofing it. You
Right.
know? It's
By
like,
then.
yes.
And he was at a different phase of his career. At
Yeah,
that
but
point,
I
so-
didn't, they weren't about to take me to Pit and Pendulum. Are you kidding me? You know?
Right,
So
right.
I didn't really see any of them until I was like in my 20s.
Okay. And do you have a favorite of the ones you have seen?
So now I've seen them all, and the only one I can't watch is Witchfinder General because it's just so brutal. But,
Right.
yeah, I mean, and now I kind of get it. Like, I mean, I think my favorite scene in Dr. Phibes is the one, and it's disgusting, where the, rats are eating the
Yes,
pilot,
yes.
but I love it so much because, the plane crashes
so
and my dad
creative.
does the, the little applause.
Right.
I love that, and I think to myself, you are laughing as rats are eating that man's skin, so I'm like, look at you, look how far you've come. But,
Proud
so,
moment.
yeah, exactly, but, my mother couldn't watch either. Like on Halloween, my dad was never home, before Halloween because obviously it was, his busy season.
Right.
And my mother's, jack-o'-lanterns were like unflaggingly cheerful, big smiles and page boy haircuts and ribbons on the things. She wasn't into the scary stuff either.
So did you guys decorate for Halloween?
Oh,
Did you
sure.
get trick-or-treaters?
No,
and did
we
he?
didn't get
Oh,
trick-or-treaters.
okay. I was about to
But
say, I
we-
can imagine if Vincent Price shows up as
At
you're
the house.
trick-or-treating at the
No,
house.
because it was gated.
Right,
But-
right.
So what I will tell you is, so I was allowed one candy a week, and I do not mean a Baby Ruth bar. I mean like a butterscotch, right?
Okay.
So I was a little bit candy obsessed. So Halloween, they couldn't take my candy away. I mean, that was hard-earned
Right.
candy, right? So we had this like early RV. It was called the Clark Cortez. It was sort of like a beige milk truck, but it had the beds and the dining table and all the stuff. And we would go, that was when my dad was on the arts and crafts board. So we went all over the country, Oregon and New Mexico and the Dakotas and, Oklahoma in this thing,
Right.
best part of my childhood. And so they had this idea that we would go trick-or-treating in that. I would invite my closest girlfriends and we'd go trick-or-treating. Well, I was like obsessed because I was going to find the best candy and how to get the most. So, and I was just there like last weekend walking these streets, but I had this idea that, okay, you want to be able to go fast, right, to get us to as many houses as possible. But wouldn't the rich people have the best candy? That was right. I mean, it seemed logical. So I'm like, we're going to the flats of Beverly Hills. We're not going to the hills of Beverly Hills. It would take too long and it's exhausting. So they would park at the top in the RV and my mother would have cute little snacks and then my dad would take us out and we'd go knock on the doors. Well, I have, barely any memory of this because I was just obsessed with the candy.
Productivity.
But, right. But my dad would like sometimes, pop out from behind the bush. And then he'd pop out and he'd scare the people at the houses, which of course, people loved because there's Vincent Price on Halloween. And I have some cute pictures of all of us, on Halloween. And the other part about Halloween in my household is like I would say, Mom, I want to be a cowboy. I want to be whatever. And my mother would turn me, like I have one picture, I'm sitting on my dad's knees and all my girlfriends, were maybe, 8 or something. And they're all like, a ballerina and a Chinese princess and whatever, right? And I'm like some scary orange clown with a ruff from like a Bob Fosse musical. I'm like, I didn't even like clowns. Like I hated Halloween. So it was only the candy that made Halloween good.
Oh my
So.
goodness. Well, speaking of spooky things, and since we're speaking of more the horror phase, so he really enjoyed working with certain people like Roger Corman.
Roger Corman, Bill Castle,
Yeah. And did he, I asked what your favorite was. Did your father have a favorite of his horror films that he really enjoyed?
People ask me that a lot. I think he would say, there's a guy in LA who seems to think he's the big expert on Vincent Price, and maybe my dad said this to him at one point.
Okay.
So I think Tomb of Ligeia was mentioned as a favorite of his.
Maybe it was that day.
Yeah, exactly. But what I did hear him say is the movies that were really important. Like House of Wax was absolutely clearly the most important movie
And really
for
was
his
pivotal
career.
in his career, right?
Totally, his career when that turned him into a horror star. So he recognized that was a huge film for his career. The Bill Castle thing, same thing. Like that was 5 years later, and it introduces him to this whole new audience. And then Roger, right? 6 Poe films. I mean, my dad felt. some of them weren't
Right.
but
Loosely Poe.
yeah. My dad really felt like Edgar Allan Poe was the most important American voice in the sense that pre-Poe, Europe looked on America as this upstart, like wannabe, nothing to contribute to global conversation and culture. But Poe was the first American that Europeans were like, that's interesting.
Paying attention
And
to
then they're copying him, he created the detective story, French authors like, Maupassant are like drawn to Poe. So, that was huge. And so for my dad to be associated with Poe and kind of, let's face it, like Poe and Price are like often people's gateway drug because that junior high school teacher's like, I'm not in the mood to teach today. I'm just going to slap on,
It was for me. I was probably 12 when I started reading Edgar Allan Poe, and it was right around the time that I discovered a lot of your father's films. And that was exactly a gateway into that, even though I was too afraid to go to the bathroom unless my sister came with me, because we'd stay up late on a Friday night watching, because that's often when they would come out. But it got me interested in Edgar Allan Poe, so I was reading at the same time, and I think that that is also one of the real treasures about your father, is that he would bring this class, this sense of this person is really taking this quite seriously in everything he did. So you wanted to root for him even when he was the villain.
Yes.
And you sense somehow he's actually a nice guy. I just know he's a nice guy, even when he would play these evil characters.
That's, I think, the Vincent Price alchemy, right? Like it starts with House of Wax, right? I mean, really, literally, he's nuts. You know? I mean, let's just take it on the, he's nuts. But you understand why he's nuts, because these guys destroyed his life's work. He's killing people, hanging them in elevator shafts, stealing bodies from the morgue, dipping them in wax, and then, pretending that they're not. They really are Marie Antoinette. I mean, none of this is good stuff, right? And we're all rooting for him.
Absolutely.
Everyone's rooting for him,
He's
right?
the bad guy, and you want him to
Yeah,
somehow.
Same with House on Haunted Hill.
Yeah.
You're like, well, I think this guy's kind of a misogynist jerk, and then of course the whole story turns, but you're still rooting for him.
And it's funny how you're rooting more for him than his wife,
Right,
even though
it's
like, is that right?
Right, I know, exactly. The interesting thing about this thing I did at the Hammer, it came about because a grad student getting her master's just loved my dad, and she did this paper on using my dad's career as sort of how television could make or break an actor's career based on their live persona, how television brought people into people's households. And my dad was made for television. He was a raconteur. He was a great storyteller. You could bring him on and he could cook. You could bring him on and he could recite. You could bring him on and he could tell a story. You could bring him on and he could guest host. He could do anything, and he was so charming. So there were people who were drawn to my dad's characters, and you sense, other than in Witchfinder General, you sense that he's a nice guy. And then you see him on television or his egghead or whatever, and you know he's a nice guy, and he's funny, and it's that perfect place to sort of explore your fears safely, which I think he understood, like he loved being a horror star, but he also made it very clear to people that this is a conscious act, kind of like a Shakespeare play, right? Shakespeare, I was watching something on, I love Shakespeare. I had a teacher in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. It was just a Shakespeare fanatic. But this woman was explaining certain things about Shakespearean language, so of course I was watching it. But she was talking about how everything was an inside joke with the audience, and that there was this, this line that was crossed where absolutely the players on the stage in Shakespeare were interacting with the audience clearly, and my dad definitely does that in the movie. There is all the movies, he's sort of reaching out through the screen, and so the fact that then you could see him on the Dinah Shore show or Johnny Carson cooking a fish in a dishwasher, and they're sloshing back the wine and laughing, you're like, okay, this guy, I love the horror stuff, and he scares me, but I think he likes scaring me, and he's funny and he's interesting. And it was I think it all kind of created the package of the perfect way to explore fear.
Right.
In, let's face it, during the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the middle of the Vietnam War, during the middle of the McCarthy era, all of these things that were like now, consuming us and scary.
And it did make you feel like you're in a safe space to root for him because you knew deep down that he had that, he's actually gonna be okay.
And I think, I think it's why horror, we give this award every other year. It's called the Price Award. And the first person we gave it to was Joe Dante, which is now almost like 10 years. But I was standing talking to him in Quentin Tarantino's movie theater, and there had been like an earthquake, so we were all out in the lobby or something. And I said, who would have thunk that horror would be like the genre? My dad would have loved that. He was mocked for doing horror. And Joe Dante said, yeah, the almighty Western, where is that? And piddly little horror now is the king. But I think it's absolutely a reflection of our times. We don't really have any faith that the man in the white hat is going to come in and save everything. Chances are the man in the white hat is going to get rid of people who look like, most of us. Exactly. So we're all kind of scared of the man in the white hat, whereas the person who feels like the outsider and, is supposedly the bad guy is probably the person who's going to be the safe one, in some way.
And I do think that there's a lot of people who were introduced to your father at different points in his career, but also in different facets of his career.
Sure.
So there are people that, whether you were a film noir fan and you saw him that way, or maybe it was the horror stuff and you were definitely a big Roger Corman fan, or maybe you were a Batman TV fan.
Or Tim Burton, or
so
Thriller,
many.
Or Scooby-Doo. I mean, I'm always like, kind of gauging and like, okay, what did they find first, And Tim was huge and Thriller was huge, but Scooby-Doo was huge. Yeah. Yeah.
And it is fascinating because there are enough people that have said, it's like, who's that voice in that Michael Jackson Thriller? And then you explain it and everything, and I'm like, and here's all these other cool things about him we should explore.
I was with an 8-year-old last week, and he's totally getting into horror, and he was really pushing me hard to tell me I was not going to be scared of Alien. I'm like, no, trust me. I'm going to be so scared of Alien. He's like, why? It's not scary at all. And he built this this kid is amazing. He built this amazing alien. I mean,
wow.
It was fantastic. Scared the hell out of me. And, but so I was trying to explain who my dad was, and he's a really smart kid. So I said, look, let's watch this thing of my dad's. But, it may be too young for him. He's 8, but he's a very smart 8. So we watched The Great Mouse Detective on Disney, which is, he plays Professor Ratigan.
More palatable.
Yeah. And I thought, oh God, you just watch Alien, he's not going to be interested in this. But he loved it, he loved it. And he was like, it's so fun,
Well, and then some people may know him through cooking, cookbooks, and both your parents were really successful with a series of cookbooks, and he would go on to shows and do cooking and so forth.
Yeah, the first cookbook sold 360,000 copies. I mean,
incredible.
Silver Magazine called it one of the 100 most important culinary events of the 20th century. I mean, that's crazy.
Wow.
So yeah, it wasn't just like some hobby, but the through line of it all was my dad fell in love with the arts, and he saw them. There wasn't any difference between a quilter and a fine sculptor. There wasn't any difference between, an actor and a chef. Anyone who was involved in the arts was so important to the fabric of society. And that was really his message and his mission. And, he just didn't make those distinctions. Like there's fine arts and there's crafts and there's performing arts and, so, yeah. And so we gave the award again this year, and this year it was Rick Baker. And it was really fun because I always give this little kind of dog and pony thing, and as I'm looking at Rick's stuff, I was really struck because Rick says over and over again, and then he told these amazing stories, that he fell in love with sort of this act of creation as a little kid. and his parents encouraged him, and he basically just kept doing what he loved his entire career. And then when, you know, CGI took over, he retired, and he's like, hey, you want to come see my studio where I'm still over there making stuff? I'm like, yeah, and I'm going to bring this 8-year-old kid with me, because
Right.
this kid is going to have this. I mean, next time I'm in LA, I'm taking Lucian and we're going, you know, and it's going to be, you know, amazing for this kid to see, wow, look what you can do. But the thing of it is that was the same with Rick. He found something he loved, and he did it. My dad had the good fortune to find something he loved and get paid to do it. Most of us don't have that.
This is very true.
You know, most of us don't get paid. We find a way to do what we love, but we're making our living
It's tough
some
in the
other
arts,
way.
for
Yeah.
sure.
And so my dad understood that was a gift, and then he would lecture 60 cities in 65 days on the arts every year for 30 years. The school he visited the most, other than East LA, is not far from here. It's like, I don't know, 2 hours from here, and it's Truman State, which used to be Northwest Missouri. I don't know. Anyway, it's a state.
Yeah.
It's a state liberal arts college,
It's not
right
too far from here.
over there. You know, just close. I mean, I drove here from Kansas. Drove there from Kansas City. It was like
Right.
an hour and a half. And he still has an acting scholarship that he gave money to.
Wow.
And
Another Midwest connection.
yeah, he loved going there because he felt like it was so great for a state school to be a liberal arts school.